Hello and welcome to the University of St Andrews online events programme. I'm delighted to have been asked to deliver one of our lectures for alum supporters and friends. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Rebecca Sweetman and I am a Professor of Archaeology in the School of Classics at the University. My area of specialisation is really in the archaeology of Greece, so I look at all periods, but the area I work primarily in is that of Roman and late antique Greece. So that's a period of about the 1st century BCE to around the 7th century CE. And what I'm going to talk to you today about is the idea of Christianization. And we're going to look at Christianization processes in the Eastern Mediterranean, primarily in Greece, primarily in the Peloponnese, to look at the archaeology of this period, which actually tells quite a different story to the traditional views that are given by the literary sources. Thank you. So let's have a look at the archaeology of Christianity and the Christianization of Greece. From the 1st to the 4th centuries, literary data attests to the presence of Christian communities. And although we have the literary sources to tell us this, actually they're not visible at all very much in the archaeological record of Roman Greece. The earliest churches that we have in Greece, and in fact in lots of other areas too, are built from the mid-4th century at their earliest, but primarily actually from the early 5th century onwards. What we have is a situation where elements of Christian and polytheistic cult are manifested peacefully side by side, but we don't often see this, and we certainly don't really see it in the literary sources, and we'll come on to that in a second. In terms of what we know traditionally about the Christianization of the Eastern Mediterranean, is that it's specifically ascribed to St. Paul and his travels across the Mediterranean. And it's no surprise that many of the places that are associated with this early Christianization are places that are on major routes. So Paul must have been traveling with traders, and we know from his letters that he was at Philippi, which is on the Via Egnatia, and also Thessaloniki as well. But the same is true of Corinth. Now, in spite of St. Paul's early visit to Corinth, there really isn't any huge amounts of evidence for a Christian population until much, much later. So the earliest church in Corinth, for example, is not constructed until at its earliest, late 4th or early 5th century. There was an expectation, though, of a visible difference in Christian populations, in part because the literary sources were deliberately out to polarize the communities of Christians and non-Christians. It was, for example, in their interest of the Christians and the desire of some of these sources to promulgate the idea of Christianity and its victory in the face of adversity. So this idea of victory was more useful for Christianization processes than one where there were people living peacefully together. However, other sources, such as the Theodosian Code, suggest something quite different, even a kind of contradiction. In the one hand, in the Theodosian Code, we hear of the laws about the closure of temples, the ending of cult practices, but on the other hand, there's also laws about having to invest in some of the temples because they're considered to be important cultural elements of a town. So there's not necessarily a straightforward view here. Many Christian sources indicate a swift victory of Christianity over a belligerent polytheistic population, while non-Christian sources, such as Eunapius, describe a dark time in the 4th century. In his Lives of the Philosophers and Sophists, he describes a general gloom that descended over the fair earth. In terms of the actual archaeological data and what we know with a combination of the literary, we can see that there were changes, which were religious and social changes. And generally speaking, sociological approaches have identified two source processes for these kinds of changes, and they are either tension or emergent. Now, partly due to reliance on the written sources, processes of Christianization in the past have been understood in terms of tension change, where change grows from unrest such as urban decline, earthquakes, or even sanctuary closure. But really, the archaeological evidence suggests a more emergent process in the Greek provinces. What we're dealing with is a kind of a bias, where we have the written sources who talk about this very sensationalist approach of destruction and disruption, which, is the kind of thing that people would record because that's of interest to historians. It's more exciting. And indeed, the same is true of the contemporary public. So, for example, in this movie Agora, we hear about the philosopher who is battling these Christians to maintain her library, her temple in Alexandria, I should have said. And the story of the Christians is one where they're bad people bringing an end to kind of these cultural traits. And the same actually continues even in kind of more scholarly arenas, where we have this book, for example, which at the back of it talks about how the Christianization of Greece was a catastrophe that precipitated the fall of Rome, and the Christians made Greece a cemetery, which quite unintentionally preserved the aftermath of their murder and genocide. So there's a lot of work to be done in terms of redressing the bias. And to do that, what we are going to do is have a look for the evidence for Christian groups starting in the Roman period. And then what we'll do is highlight processes of Christianization through the archaeological data with a focus on the Peloponnese. And we'll focus on the period from about the 1st century to about the 5th century CE. And the area that we're talking about is indeed primarily the Peloponnese in that southern part of Greece, but we'll also refer to the Cycladic islands a bit as well. So before we get into it, first let's start by looking at the actual evidence for Christian populations in Greece from the 1st century onwards. There's lots of literary evidence. We have evidence for bishops in the form of letters, for example. So Eusebius records an account of a letter just one letter, but a series of letters between the bishops of Corinth and the bishop of Knossos. So Bishop Dionysius of Corinth is urging Bishop Pintius of Knossos to be more lenient with his congregation. He felt that the bishop of Knossos was being far too strict with his flock. We also know the names of many bishops from their attendance at the ecumenical councils from the 4th century. So, for example, we know bishops from the town of Sicyon and Patras, both in the Peloponnese, attended the Council of Sardica in 344. We also know that from the Cyclades, a bishop from Andros was at the Council of Alexandria in 362, and also bishops from Argos and Sparta were representative of the Council of Constantinople in 381. And although we have these very clear literary sources for these individuals, not just kind of Christian groups, but actual individuals, there's very little evidence within the archaeological data to show their Christian communities on the ground. The main evidence we do have is in the form of mortuary data. And in fact, one of the best preserved cemeteries, Christian cemeteries in the whole of the Eastern Mediterranean, comes from Melos, which is one of the islands in the Cyclades. It's in the southwest part of the Cyclades. Now, these catacombs in Melos, there are 3 galleries of catacombs that have been explored already. They consist of a huge number of these rock-cut chambers. Some are 2-story chambers, some are single chambers, some had multiple inhumations, some had just single inhumations. Many of them had wall paintings or inscriptions within the tomb itself. Now, they were in use from the 2nd to the 5th century CE. And as I said, it's one of the few examples of an exclusively Christian cemetery that we find. What we tend to find is that it's actually very difficult to identify exclusively Christian burials. The goods that we have tend to be fairly ubiquitous, where it's jewellery or personal items occurring in the burials. or things like these small glass bottles, which may have been used as part of the funerary rituals. The easiest way to identify some of the earliest Christian burials is through the presence of a cross or another Christian symbol on the inscription. And that's partly because it's really quite a very slow process of standardization in Christian burials, which took the form, of course, of the east-west orientation of the body and then the ultimate exclusion of grave goods later on. Ironically, traditional elements of burial continue. So while the placement of the coins on the eyes was quite a common feature in burials, so that you would pay the ferryman to cross the river, Chiron, this actually continues even with Christian burials. So you get a situation where you have Christian burials with the coins on the eyes and then an inscription which clearly has a cross donating that it's a Christian burial. So graves and sarcophagi were often marked with a Chi-Rho, a cross, or another Christian symbol. In terms of their dedications, that might comprise the name of the deceased or other personal or family details, including their occupation and religion, of course, through the cross. This one, for example, comes from Argos, and what we have here is a commemoration of Melos, who was a carpet weaver, and his wife Constantina. We also have gravestones from Athens, which reveal that Christians may have led a variety of occupations, from physicians to grave diggers. And as one might expect, there is a mixture of traditional forms of names and conventions which continued alongside a new ideology of salvation. We have, for example, several forms from Argos and indeed from Corinth, where you have, say, for example, the name of the individual with a cross, and then, it talks about salvation, and then at the bottom it has a curse, which says, don't touch this grave or you'll be cursed. So it's a very nice combination of very Christian ideology and then clinging on to this traditional idea of don't touch my grave or you'll be cursed. It's not just the kinds of names and inscriptions that continue or even the sentiments, but also in terms of imagery. Lots of the similar imagery that's been used in the Roman period continues to be used even in Christian graves too. So, for example, lots and lots of ideas of paradise, which is just simply depictions of flowers and trees and animals. And the really good example of this is the tomb of Aurelia Procla, which has been reconstructed in the Byzantine Museum in Thessaloniki. But it's not just in these realms, in these mortuary realms, that we see this continuation of imagery. So, for example, in a reliquary, we have the dance of three muses dancing, three graces dancing here. And in this one here, which actually is mortuary, is the Sidamara sarcophagus, which these fragments are in the Byzantine Museum in Athens. And what we see in this sarcophagus is an image of a philosopher who could actually be an image of Christ without any issue at all, along with the Dioscuri and the Muses as well. We also see similar kind of combination or similarly dual imagery being found on lamps. So on the one hand, you could have very straightforward Christian imagery. So, for example, on this lamp here, you can see the Chi-Rho symbol. But this lamp, it depends on context and how you read the image of the peacock. Now, if this was in a polytheistic context, the peacock is always associated with Hera. But in a Christian context, the peacock is a symbol of resurrection, and the eyes of the tail of the peacock are associated with the all-seeing church. The slow pace of religious change and the shared traditions is also reflected in the epigraphic data on a range of levels, from personal practice to community organization. For example, we see two Taurobolic altars, which are currently in the National Museum in Athens. This is one of them here with the inscription, that indicate that the Taurobolium was still performed in Athens even at the end of the 4th century. So even when Christianity has become the state religion, there is very overt evidence for the continuation of cult practice, and the Taurobolium is very much one of those elite sort of cult practices too. And one of the altars, which was dedicated by Agios, which we have here, notes that he was resident in Argos, where he had been initiated into a range of local cults. So it's not just the Taurobolium is continuing, but also lots of other kind of cult practice is happening too. And it wasn't just in these kind of very specific personal connections that cult was continuing. So as I said, Christianity is by now state religion, but even in places such as Epidavros and Olympia, we know that cult practice was continuing in the sanctuaries. So in spite of laws being issued to say that cult should no longer be practiced, we know, for example, from epigraphic data at Epidavros, that there were still sacrifices being undertaken even while Christianity was state religion. And the same too at Olympia. There, it wasn't really until after the second decree of prohibition issued by Theodosius II that cult activity came to an end at Olympia in the mid-5th century. It is notable in both of these places that there were two of the earliest churches in Greece constructed at the very edges of the sanctuary. This is the remains of the church at Epidavros and the remains of the church at Olympia, which was constructed in the workshop of Agios. And it is quite clear from the archaeological data that the construction of both of these churches was happening while cult practice was still going on at these major sanctuaries too. And this is the same of many sanctuaries in Greece. It's the same at, for example, Nemea, and it's the same too at Delphi. So these major sanctuaries have dual cult being practiced, both polytheistic cult and Christianity. In fact, the long-held belief that temples were automatically converted into Christian churches has been successfully challenged for most areas, certainly in Greece, but also for areas such as Agia and Egypt and also parts of Turkey too. In fact, what I would argue is that a key element in this incremental Christianization process was the manipulation of memory and tradition to allow a smooth transition of Christianity rather than the more forceful closure and destruction of pre-Christian cult, for which we actually have very little evidence. So while epigraphic evidence indicates a steady growth of the Christian presence throughout the 4th century in terms of bishops and slowly but surely the burial evidence, the earliest churches in the Greek provinces are found in Macedonia, that's in northern Greece. So for example, we have Agios Demetrius in Thessaloniki, and also in the islands such as the Cyclades. Now, the Cycladic Islands are of the first to have some of these early Christian churches in the 4th century. So, for example, the Catacombs church on Paros, as you can see here, this is the outside, this is the baptistry of that church. And we have the outside of the church. Now, it was originally constructed possibly in the late 4th century, but the main body of the church was later, was a Justinianic construction. And also the church at Peloponnese in the coast of Andros, that's likely to be a early 5th century construction. But once these churches are constructed in northern Greece and in the islands, the Cycladic Islands, it is at that point that we start getting early church construction on islands such as Crete. So, for example, the KMF Basilica, which is just outside the edges of Knossos, that was constructed in the early 5th century, and then in places like Thessaly, you start getting church construction. In fact, places like Athens and the Peloponnese are relatively late in its church construction, and it may be to do with pilgrimage networks that induces this reason. But let's have a look at the Peloponnese to see how some of the data can be applied. So just to recap, this is the area of the Peloponnese here, Athens is here, the Cycladic Islands are in this area here. So northern Greece, Thessaloniki sees some of the earliest churches. Now bear in mind Thessaloniki is on the Via Egnatia, so would have been a direct route between here and Istanbul. The Cycladic Islands were of course a major routeway across the Mediterranean, and you can imagine these routes coming from the Holy Land. Crete too, so the Cycladic Islands and then Crete and then the Peloponnese, so it is really quite behind in everything. In the Peloponnese itself, there are around 140 churches from the late antique period, and there is a huge variation. So these are the churches here, and here they are on the Google Maps here to show you their locations and density. There's a massive variation in the churches. Now, the triple-aisled single apse is the most common, but within that, there's huge variety in terms of the annexes, in terms of the presence of baptistries or, martyria and things like that. The churches themselves, this is the one at Epidavros, which we will return to, vary in size in terms of annexes as well. The church at Malawi has another kind of a apsidal element to it, and here we have the sanctuary of Apollo Church at Argos, where there is a massive well, massive atrium, and also a baptistry associated with it. The function of the churches vary quite considerably too. So, for example, this one at Argos is likely to be a baptistry church, whereas this church at Tigani in the Mani is very much a cemetery church. And if you get up here ever, there's piles and piles of snakes around, so be warned, it's not the most pleasant of visits. So Tigani in the Mani is a cemetery church. They also vary in size massively. One of the biggest is this church at Lycheon, which is just on the edge of Corinth, and you can see how close it is to the sea. This church at Lycheon, from end to end, is the size of a football pitch. It is massive. Whereas this tiny wee church at Kenkriai would fit essentially into the apse and the Vima area of the Lycheon Basilica itself. So they vary in size massively. They also vary in levels of preservation. So very often the churches, these late antique churches, are preserved underneath later churches, later Byzantine churches. This is Andreas in the Mani. And also under modern churches as well. And I mean, there must be a Byzantine church here. So this is the Marina church, which is in the Argolid, quite close to Epidavros actually. And the late antique church, which you can see here, was found during a renovation of the much later church, which was on top. And then they preserved it by having these kind of floating foundations. Although a great deal of work has been undertaken on the excavation and publication of over 100 of these churches, the chronologies of many of the known Peloponnesian churches are often difficult to define. This is in part because of the nature of their survival or their difficult excavation circumstances. But what we can tell is that the earliest churches were constructed either in the major ports of the northwest, so for example Lycheon and Kenkriai, or at sanctuaries, at popular and often pan-Hellenic sanctuaries like Olympia, Epidavros, which was the healing sanctuary, and up in the north in Delphi. It was after these port constructions and the sanctuary constructions that the next wave of church building happens in towns, and then the latest churches are found in rural areas. So what we have is an emergent process which sees three phases of church building. We have the earliest church building at ports and in sanctuaries. So basically in really well-populated spaces where lots of people are going. So you would expect that this would be receptive and open to change. And then from those places, the idea of the church building spreads into the towns. And so you can imagine that people who have visited the ports or the sanctuaries are going back to their towns. And then from the towns, they're networked out into the rural areas. What we can see is that there is an emergent pattern in these three different phases. And let's have a quick look. These are the earliest churches in the Peloponnese, these red star ones. And you can see that they're occurring at sanctuaries like Olympia and Epidavros, and then these huge ports like Ermione, which is down here, but also at the ports up in the north, like Sicyon, for example, too. So ports and sanctuaries. Then the next churches that are constructed are constructed in the towns. So the first churches that are constructed are likely constructed as a part to do with complexity, which is this theory of having to adapt to survive, where people are sharing properties. The next phase, which is where they move into the towns, is social movement, where it's like a competitive element where you're striving to have what others have. And there is a sense of kind of need to have it. And we see this very clearly in the second phase, where the churches are spreading out into the major towns. But we can also see it in the church buildings themselves, which I'll come on to in 1 second. Here we have the town of Argos. And the earliest churches are absolutely constructed around the edges of the town. And you can imagine that this is the case because it's still quite tentative. You build your church, but while you're building the church, everybody else is still practicing polytheistic cult. And so you don't want to build the churches in too overt a place because that would create tension. And so they build them at the edges of the town, sometimes in cemeteries, and we'll come on to that in a second, which are very visible spots, but also on major routeways as well. And so you put your church on a major routeway or in a cemetery, and lots of people are seeing it. So this is the second phase of church building. But the other thing we have with our churches at this point is visible in the first churches too, I have to say, is this idea of making them unbelievably attractive and exclusive. So we have this sense of social exclusivity, and this is a church in Sparta, on the Acropolis of Sparta, that I excavated along with a Greek colleague a number of years ago. And what we did was we recreated the church so that we could understand the use of space within the various elements of the church. Now, traditionally, it's deemed that the men were down on the lower floors here and women were on the upper floors. And when we modeled this, it turned out that if you were on the lower floor, you had a partial view of the kind of ceremony that was going on, but in the upper floors, you had an excellent view of the kind of ceremony that was going on. So contrary to popular belief about how women had a kind of a less good view of what was going on, in fact, it turns out that they probably had a really good view of what was going on within the ceremonies within the churches. But again, what we have is this idea of exclusivity. If you're in these aisles, you have a reasonable view, but actually if you're in the back here of the church, you have a fairly crummy view, and you could kind of participate your way into the higher standard of views in these kind of church patterns. So what we have then is social movement is the second phase of church building. So within the emergent pattern, we have complexity, which we've seen, where the newest churches are built in highly accessible areas where the population is used to new ideas, and there's a mix of groups. So sharing of ideas is primary, and we can explain this through complexity theory. And now this sharing of ideas can only work when there's a regular flow of traffic. The next phase, which can be identified as social movement, is marked by these construction of churches in urban spaces like Corinth and Argos that we've already seen, and it works along the lines of a network society, and it's really dominated by these urban constructions. And then we have the third one, which is tipping point. Tipping point is essentially the phase that sees the most widespread construction, and it's with an extensive spread into the rural areas. Now, before I go any further, I should stress that these phases are not tied exclusively to particular periods, and they can be really fluid in where they're happening and when. This third phase is more tentative, particularly as it's dealing with the most conservative populations, the rural dwellers. It's one represented by the occupation of extra-urban space and can be seen as a result more of a tipping point process, which essentially takes a while and takes over those traditionally known to be slowest to change. What happens is all around, so in the cities, in the ports, and in the sanctuaries, there are churches being constructed, and then a certain momentum starts to accumulate, and the numbers of churches being built outweighs the existing cult practice, and so people begin to adopt it. And the topography of these churches in this phase is very obviously meant to show, the topography shows us that visibility is absolutely key to this phase. So you're putting churches on hills with 360 views, for example. And so rallying points, because it's less cohesive, this tipping point is less cohesive, rallying points are really, really important. What we can also tell is that these early phases, so the first phase and even the second phase, but definitely the first phase, are likely to be deliberate, chosen processes and likely to come from places such as Constantinople. And we can see this even in some of the church decoration, that it's echoing some of the Constantinopolitan styles. The crucial point with the identification of these phases means that several elements of Christianization can be realized. It's multi-directional, so we can have different groups steering the processes at different times, so church leaders, Constantinople, and imperial groups, to kind of local priests, local elite, and broader swathes of the population. It's not monolithic, so different phases within areas may be equated with what's going on in the countryside, so it can't be too sweeping. It also allows for a diversity of change in accordance with new and developing social changes, too. What they don't explain in terms of these processes is how it's actually actively activated and encouraged. In each case, what we've seen is visibility is key. So the edge of a port where you have lots of people, that's really visible. The edge of a sanctuary where you have lots of people coming in, even to the point where in Epidavros, the church is built at the main entrance to the sanctuary. So visibility is key. But that's not enough. Communities need encouragement to adopt the new religion, no matter how peacefully it's done. And this is where the role of memory manipulation and architecture comes in. Now, we've already seen how you have a kind of an exclusive element to the church that makes people tempted by it. But throughout the different Christianization phases, memory and tradition were managed by the church in terms of where it chose to put the church, what kind of architecture it chose, and the kinds of rituals it had. It is likely that the church consciously maintained certain traditions, that is, of place, imagery, and action, in order to retain and use memory traces from the established religious structures to help situate the Christian church as a central element of community life and identity. Memories are based on experience and tradition, so they can be easily used in transit to help a new experience or agenda by exploiting a similar location or architectural form and presenting analogous imagery. Participation in traditional activities associated with a cult site, for example, will create an implicit memory which can be triggered by repeated actions. Repeated rituals, such as procession, ritual dining, perhaps even chanting, are central to this notion. Since memory is progressive, collective memories which retain certain traditional values can be transferred to a new establishment as long as there's some constant triggers. So what we can really see when we dive deeper into it is that many of the churches are built beside spaces that have meaning already. So, for example, this church at Koniditsa, which is just outside of Sparta, is constructed right beside a major water source. So, like, this well has been used for centuries, and you have people gathering here. And so the natural gathering point is taking on a new gathering, but for the purpose of going to the church rather than just for water. So we have also a similar tradition with the Panagea Church, which is near Olympia, where they're using the new church is constructed beside this waterfall. They're using natural gathering points such as points of beauty, but they're also using cemeteries and martyria as well. And so with the cemeteries, most of which are constructed just outside the city walls, some of the earliest churches in the urban space are found in these areas just outside the city walls. And so, for example, this is the North Cemetery at Knossos, where you have people who would have maybe regularly gone to the cemetery. With the construction of the church within the cemetery area, you're transposing that tradition of going to the cemetery to see the dead, and then having the same kind of route to go and see the cemetery, go and see the church for the church's sake rather than the cemetery's sake. It's also the same where you have churches along routeways and indeed beside sanctuaries. This bridging concept of memory and tradition assisting the transition from polytheism to Christianity can also be understood with the help of Giddens' structuration theory and memory traces. Coexisting social structures, so that is different cult practices within a single environment, will have bridging elements, and these create tangible means for the retention of memory. So, for example, like the construction of a church on the edge of a sanctuary. It's worth noting here that the use of existing sacred space is focused on the construction of churches beside sacred buildings of functioning rather than obsolete sites. So there's no point in constructing a church at a polytheistic sanctuary that's gone out of use. The more often a particular location is visited or an image is seen, the more likely a memory will be formed. This is also more blatantly the case with the use of familiar elements of polytheistic practice, such as the use of oracles to ratify something new. So, for example, the construction of the church of the Panagea and the Acropolis in the Parthenon was constructed thanks to an oracle from Delphi. So it's a fantastic mix of traditions there. Further recall can be triggered by seeing a familiar image. So, for example, we have Orpheus here, which is in the traditional form with his lyre, and the animals surrounding Orpheus, and then we have Christ, which recalls the image of Orpheus, giving a sense of familiarity. And so we have experiencing music or other stimulus can also trigger these memories. Visiting a place can trigger the memories, or through someone else recalling the experience of the same ritual or ceremonies. Overall, these memories may not depend on tradition, but tradition forms part of the process. So let's have a look with Epidavros. So Epidavros, as we said, is located at the very entranceway to the main area of the sanctuary. This is the major church here, and this is the major gateway into the sanctuary. And although we know that sacrifice was banned, it's clear from the Theodosian Code that processions were allowed to continue. So the people would have processed up here and maybe seen the church, but carried on into the sanctuary. And at some point, the route then changes. So the route continues to be the same, but instead of going into the sanctuary, people peel off into the church. And the church would have been a massive building and very, very, very enticing as well. So it's enclosed. There's possibly, a large apse to it here. And within the church, it would have been marvelous mosaics as well. So although the details of the participants in the procession to the church are lacking, assuming there would have been these processions, it can at least be postulated that the same kind of hierarchies would continue to be expressed. So where you would have had elites leading the procession in the sanctuary, presumably elites would have led the procession into the church. In the Epidavros church, the altar is located here in the east, of course, in the apse. The enclosed vimma here would have made it difficult for the congregation to see elements of the rituals involved. However, extension out would have had a narrow doorway, and then you could have shown people these elements of the liturgy, which is all part of a revelation. So, a member of the clergy might appear in the vimma and show a chalice or show an element of a sacred object or element of the ritual. So when you would enter the church itself, a visitor might encounter familiar floor mosaics or an image of Christ in a wall painting or mosaic or a good shepherd. The iconography of images would have been familiar and previously recognized as familiar images within the repertoire, the earlier repertoire, and that indeed could have triggered a range of memories of comfort and security in a space and place, which would have been compounded by a suite of familiar elements already. Repeated routes and actions and high sensory pageantry would have helped trigger and transmit memories in an active way, while within the church, obscured views and revelatory elements would have induced a heightened sense of agency, thereby maximizing memory recall. Although the details of the meaning behind the rituals may not have been remembered, the events would have been, and the memory triggers would allow for the congregation to feel comfortable with the rituals, even if they didn't always necessarily understand the reason for them. The new rites with dramatic elements were more memorable and transmissible, even though they may have been less familiar to the audience. So, to conclude, although the widespread construction of churches is perceived as a significant change in society, in many respects is not as dramatic as it might seem on the surface. Just as the slow process of religious change in the earlier periods also melds into existing society. In choosing their locations, church builders were using a social as well as spiritual process to implement the change in religion. But it was only possible through the gradual changes that had taken place over centuries rather than years. Both places and spaces, including the art and architecture, are manipulated somewhat organically through their location, but are active through the use, and this would have created a different experience of the present by making the memories of the past less meaningful, while still maintaining the strength of community identity without a risk of attention-based conversion through new social memories. That many of the churches were located in the regions of pre-Christian cemeteries or above agricultural land emphasizes ideas of kinship connections and thereby giving credibility to the church by association. Thank you very much.